The air was thick with the scent of burnt earth and charred metal, the remnants of a battle that had ravaged the once beautiful planet. Smoke swirled in the sky, and the distant echoes of laser fire vibrated through the ground beneath her feet. She had been captured by the human forces after her fleet was decimated in the war. Now, as she sat in a dark, cold prison cell, the only thing that filled her mind was the burning rage against the ones who had taken her, the humans. She had heard the stories, the tales of how humans were brutal killers, merciless and heartless, how they had razed planets, wiped out entire civilizations, and crushed those who dared to stand against them. The princess had been taught to fear them, to hate them, and she did, deeply. She had seen her people fall, her soldiers slain, and now she was their prisoner, at their mercy. Her cell was nothing more than a steel cage, small and suffocating. She had tried to escape, but there was no way out. Every time she moved, the faint hum of a cloaking field reminded her of the humans' advanced technology, how they could track her every move without her even knowing it. She hated the cold, the darkness, the sense of helplessness. Her thoughts swirled, filled with rage and fear. Her enemies were too powerful, too advanced for her people to resist. It seemed like there was no hope left. Then she heard it, the sound of footsteps approaching. Heavy, deliberate, the sound of someone who wasn't afraid to be noticed. The princess froze. Her heart skipped a beat. She had been expecting this, the moment when they would come to finish what they had started. She knew it would happen sooner or later. They would come to torture her, break her spirit, or perhaps even execute her as a symbol of their victory. The door to her cell creaked open, and for a moment, all she could see was darkness. But then, the outline of a tall figure stepped into the doorway. The flicker of light from the corridor revealed the figure of a man, human. His face was stern, his eyes cold, and his posture rigid. A soldier, she assumed, one of the many who had helped destroy her people. He was tall, imposing, his uniform a mix of tactical gear and battle-worn patches that spoke of countless battles fought. The gun strapped to his side, and the blade at his waist told her everything she needed to know. This man was no ordinary soldier. He was a killer. Her pulse quickened. She was ready for the worst. She had heard the stories of how humans tortured their enemies. She had seen the brutal methods they used. And yet, as the man stepped closer, she saw something she hadn't expected, something that made her freeze in place. His face, his expression, it wasn't filled with malice. There was no hate in his eyes, no cruelty, just an emotion she couldn't place. The coldness in his demeanor was nothing like what she had imagined. He wasn't here to gloat, to mock her, or to inflict pain. No, his eyes seemed almost tired. And there was something else, something that made her second-guess everything she thought she knew about humans. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension between them hung thick in the air. The princess couldn't understand why he was here, what he wanted from her. Why had he come? Surely it wasn't to show mercy. Was it just a different form of cruelty? The human soldier stepped forward, his boots making soft sounds on the cold floor. Without a word, he knelt down in front of her, his eyes scanning her wounds with a mix of concern and curiosity. His hands moved to touch her bruised skin, and for a moment, she recoiled instinctively. She had been prepared for violence, for torture, but not for this. This gentleness, this care. "You're injured," he said in a deep, gravelly voice. His words were simple, but there was no threat in them, no venom. He wasn't here to harm her. Instead, he pulled something from his pouch, a small med kit. The princess blinked in disbelief. Why was he helping her? Why wasn't he just finishing what had been started? Her instincts screamed at her to resist, to fight back. She had to do something. But the words caught in her throat. She had no idea how to respond. She was a princess, a leader of her people, and yet in this moment, she felt small, vulnerable. How could she have misjudged the humans so completely? "Why are you helping me?" Her voice trembled, but she couldn't stop herself from asking the question. She needed to know. Was this just another form of manipulation, a way to break her down before delivering the final blow? The human soldier didn't answer immediately. Instead, he focused on treating her wounds, cleaning the cuts on her face and hands with careful precision. His movements were methodical, yet there was a certain tenderness to them, something that took her by surprise. "I'm not here to hurt you," he finally replied, his voice softening. "I'm here to keep you alive." The words hung in the air like a strange, foreign concept. She had never expected this. She had thought all humans were the same, brutal, savage. But here was one, standing in front of her, offering her care and compassion instead of pain. She didn't know what to make of it. Was this just a tactic, a way to break her spirit before her execution? Or was this soldier truly different from the rest of his kind? Her mind raced, trying to process the confusion swirling inside her. Could this really be happening? Was it possible that a human soldier, a killer in the eyes of her people, could offer her kindness? As the soldier continued tending to her, the princess couldn't help but wonder what it all meant. Could the stories she had been told about humans be wrong? Was there more to them than she had been led to believe? She found herself looking at him, not as an enemy, but as someone different, someone she couldn't understand. The silence between them grew, but it was no longer uncomfortable. There was a strange, quiet understanding in the air. She didn't know what would happen next, but in that moment, she realized something profound. Not all humans were the monsters she had been taught to fear. There was more to them than just the stories. And perhaps, just perhaps, the soldier standing before her was proof of that. As the door to the cell slid closed behind him, leaving her alone once more, the princess was left with a single thought, a thought that would change everything. She wasn't sure what it meant, but she knew one thing for certain. She had just encountered a human unlike any she had ever imagined. Days passed since the human soldier's unexpected act of kindness, and with each new day, the princess found herself more and more puzzled by him. She had been prepared for cruelty, for violence, for the kind of brutality her people had always associated with humans. Yet here she was, in a cold cell, with nothing but silence and her thoughts. And still, that soldier's actions lingered in her mind, refusing to be forgotten. The princess had always been taught that humans were heartless creatures, merciless killers who destroyed anything they couldn't control. But this soldier, this man who attended to her wounds with such care, didn't fit the image she had been raised to believe in. She had to know more, but the opportunity to speak to him never seemed to come. The guards who watched over her were silent and cold, only delivering her food and water, never saying a word. No one came to visit her except for him. And when he did, it was always when the rest of the camp was asleep, when the world seemed to pause around them. One night, as the moonlight spilled into the room through the small barred window, she heard the familiar footsteps again, heavy, purposeful, and unmistakably human. Her heart beat a little faster in her chest as she realized who it was. He was here again, the soldier who had been so different from the rest. The princess braced herself, her mind racing with questions. Why was he coming back? Was he here to finish the job? Or perhaps was it something else? Her instincts told her to stay alert, but curiosity gnawed at her. The door to her cell creaked open quietly, and once again the soldier stepped inside. This time, however, there was a different air about him. His posture was still firm, his movements still measured, but there was something in his eyes, a distant look, like he was carrying a weight much heavier than what he showed. He wasn't here for battle, for violence, or even to continue what they had started. He was simply here, as if his presence alone meant something more than words could express. He didn't speak at first, only looked at her with a quiet understanding, as if searching for something in her expression. For a long moment, neither of them said a word. The princess, though she was filled with questions, held them all back. Something about the silence felt different this time, as if the air between them was thick with secrets, secrets that neither of them could yet share. Finally, it was the soldier who broke the silence. "You've been asking questions," he said softly, his voice low and tinged with something that almost sounded like regret. "I can see it in your eyes." The princess was stunned. How could he know? She had barely spoken to him at all since their first encounter, but there was no mistaking the truth in his words. He could see right through her, and for the first time, she felt vulnerable in a way she hadn't expected. Vulnerable not because she was a prisoner, but because the human soldier, this man who was supposed to be her enemy, seemed to understand her in a way that no one else ever had. She didn't know what to say, but her curiosity couldn't be contained anymore. "Why do you help me?" she asked, her voice quieter than before. "Why not just let me die like the others?" The soldier paused, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if the question had caught him off guard. He hadn't expected her to ask that, at least not so soon. But after a moment of silence, he sighed, looking away as if the answer was more complicated than he could explain. "It's not what I wanted," he said, finally speaking up. "I didn't sign up to be here, not like this." His words were heavy, and for the first time, the princess saw something like pain flash across his face. "I was just another soldier, another tool in the hands of a government that didn't care about me or anyone else. We were all just numbers, disposable." But then, he trailed off, his eyes darkening as if the memory was too painful to revisit. The princess leaned forward slightly, her curiosity growing with every word. She could feel the tension in the air, the weight of his unspoken truth. She had always thought humans were just mindless warriors, driven by the same hunger for conquest as the rest of the species in the galaxy. But now, as she watched him, she began to wonder if that was truly the case. Maybe there was more to him, and to humans in general, than she had been taught to believe. "There was a moment," the soldier continued, his voice thick with emotion, "when everything changed. We were sent on a mission to destroy a planet, your planet. We were supposed to wipe you all out, and I didn't question it. Not at first. But when I saw the people, your people, just like us, just trying to survive, to protect their homes, it hit me. It was wrong. This whole war, it was wrong. But by then, it was too late. They didn't care. I didn't matter to them." The princess listened intently, unable to tear her gaze away from him. This was a side of the soldier she hadn't expected, and it made her question everything she had been taught. This man, this killer, was more than just a weapon of war. He had a story, a pain, a past that was just as broken as hers. Maybe even more so. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," he added, as if speaking to himself. "Maybe I'm just trying to make sense of it all. Or maybe I just need someone to know. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even know if I can forgive myself." The princess didn't know how to respond. What could she say to that? He had come here, not to finish the mission, not to finish her, but to share his burden, his truth. And in doing so, he had shattered everything she thought she knew about humanity. For the first time since she had been captured, the princess felt something shift inside her. The anger that had burned so fiercely within her began to cool, replaced by confusion, understanding, and a strange kind of sympathy. She had been taught that all humans were the same, that they were all evil, all ruthless. But this soldier was not evil. He was simply a man, broken, flawed, and searching for redemption. She didn't know where this strange connection between them was leading, but one thing was clear. This wasn't a simple war between enemies. It was something much more complex, and the soldier standing before her had just opened her eyes to a world she had never seen before. A world where humans were not just monsters, but people with their own stories, their own struggles. And for the first time in days, the princess wasn't sure if she was still the prisoner, or if, somehow, their roles had begun to shift. The days that followed felt different, as though a strange shift had occurred between the princess and the soldier. What had started as suspicion and hatred slowly turned into something else, an unspoken understanding. The tension that once filled the air now lingered between them like a thread, fragile and barely perceptible, but still there. Every time their eyes met, there was something more, something neither of them could easily explain. But as the days passed, the world outside their small, cold room became more dangerous. The war was escalating, and the tension between the alien forces and the humans was reaching a boiling point. Rumors of impending attacks and betrayals spread through the camp like wildfire. The soldier, ever the professional, was alert to every shift, every whisper in the dark corners of their makeshift base. He knew the war wasn't just about honor anymore. It was about survival. One night, the princess overheard a conversation between the soldier and his commanding officer. She had been trying to rest in her cell, but the sounds of hushed voices drew her attention. Her instincts told her to stay hidden, to remain quiet and unnoticed. But a part of her couldn't help herself. She needed to know more. She needed to understand this man, this human who had been nothing like the stories she had been told. "Are you sure about this?" the soldier's commanding officer asked, his voice low but urgent. "The princess is still valuable. We can use her as leverage." The soldier's voice was quieter, sharper. "I don't care about leverage anymore," he said. "She's a person, not a tool. We've crossed that line already." The princess felt a strange twist in her chest at his words. The soldier was not just talking about her as a prisoner, as a prize to be won. He was talking about her as an individual, as a person. But the rest of the conversation was less reassuring. "You're getting too close to her," the officer warned. "We can't afford to get soft. You know what's at stake." There was a long pause, and for a moment, the princess wasn't sure if the soldier would respond. He was silent, but she could hear the tension in his breathing. "I'm not soft," he finally replied. "But if you order me to turn on her, I won't. I won't be your monster." The officer's laughter was cold and bitter. "We'll see. There's a big battle coming. You'll have to choose your side soon enough, and it won't be as easy as you think." The princess stood still, barely breathing, as the sounds of the conversation faded away. She was left in the silence, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never imagined that things would be this complicated. She had thought the war was simple, that it was just about winning and losing. But now she was beginning to understand that there was more at play here. The soldier, this man who had treated her with more kindness than she had ever received, was caught in something far larger than he had ever anticipated. The next day, the princess was once again brought out of her cell. The soldier was standing by her side, his usual stern expression in place. But there was something in his eyes, something that suggested he was just as unsure as she was about what was coming. They were heading into the heart of dangerous territory, and the air was thick with tension. The enemy's forces had been spotted nearby, and their camp was preparing for a possible attack. The soldiers were gearing up for battle, and everyone was on edge. As they moved through the base, the princess could feel the weight of the soldiers' stares on her. They didn't trust her, and it was clear that most of them still saw her as a prize to be claimed or a threat to be neutralized. But the soldier walking beside her was different. She could sense it in the way he moved, the way he kept his distance from the others while still protecting her. There was something he wasn't telling her, something that made the air between them feel electric, charged with the unspoken tension of their shared uncertain fate. They reached the outskirts of the base, where the landscape began to shift from the rugged terrain of the camp to the dense alien jungle beyond. The soldier stopped and turned to face her, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stay close. We're heading into a very dangerous area. The enemy is closing in, and we need to be prepared for anything." The princess nodded, her pulse quickening. She had never seen anything like the alien jungle before. The trees were massive, towering over them like ancient giants. Strange, glowing plants dotted the ground, their colors shifting in the dim light. The air was thick with humidity, and every sound in the distance made her nerves jump. As they moved deeper into the jungle, the tension between them only seemed to grow. The soldier kept glancing around, his hand hovering near the weapon at his side. He was on high alert, scanning the area for any sign of movement, while the princess couldn't help but feel the weight of the unknown pressing down on her. She wasn't trained for this. She didn't know how to survive in a jungle like this. But the soldier did. He was the one leading the way, the one keeping her safe. But even as he kept her close, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was an undeniable pull between them, an unspoken connection that was growing stronger with every step they took. The soldier's movements were deliberate, but every so often his eyes would flicker toward her. Just a brief glance, but it was enough to make her heart race. She didn't understand what it was, but the tension between them was undeniable. Suddenly, a sharp noise broke the stillness, a crackling sound that echoed through the jungle. The soldier's head snapped toward the source, his posture immediately stiffening. Without a word, he motioned for the princess to stay low. She crouched beside him, trying to make herself as small as possible, her breath catching in her throat. The air was thick with the scent of danger, and the princess could feel her heart pounding in her chest. The soldier was ready, poised like a coiled spring, and she knew that this was it, the moment where everything could change. The jungle around them was alive with movement, and the tension between them was at its peak. Whatever was coming, whatever danger awaited them, the princess couldn't help but wonder if she was truly ready for it, if she was ready for what was happening between them. And then, in the midst of the growing chaos, the soldier's hand brushed against hers, just for a moment. The briefest touch, but it sent a jolt through her that she couldn't ignore. There was something there, something more than just the threat of danger surrounding them. And for the first time, the princess found herself questioning everything. The war, her duty, and even the soldier standing beside her. Something was shifting, and neither of them knew what it would lead to. The jungle was alive with sounds, the distant hum of alien wildlife, and the rustling of trees as the wind whispered through the branches. But to the princess, everything seemed muffled, as though her senses were overwhelmed by the strange pull that was growing stronger with every moment spent beside the human soldier. The fear of the unknown, the battle that lay ahead, and the weight of her own uncertain emotions all mixed together, leaving her confused, but undeniably drawn to him. For the first time since their fateful encounter, she felt a sense of connection that she couldn't ignore. It wasn't just the danger they were facing, or the desperate situation they found themselves in. No, it was something more profound, a quiet understanding, a bond that neither of them had expected, let alone sought. It was as if the world around them had disappeared, leaving only the two of them in the vast, threatening jungle. The soldier, as stoic and hardened as he was, couldn't hide the flicker of emotion in his eyes when their hands brushed against each other earlier. He had never felt this way about anyone, not like this. He was a man trained for war, accustomed to living in a world where emotions were weaknesses and connections with others were liabilities. But when the princess was near, everything seemed different. She wasn't like the cold, calculating enemy soldiers he had fought. There was something deeply human about her, something he hadn't anticipated, and it unsettled him. His hand, still hovering near his weapon, was the only thing keeping him grounded in the present. He had been taught to expect betrayal at every turn, to trust no one, not even his own people. But with her, it was different. It felt wrong, in a way, to feel this connection. He had no place for these emotions in his world of war and violence, and yet there they were, unwelcome but undeniable. The soldier caught her gaze, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The jungle seemed to hold its breath around them, as if aware of the fragile bond forming between the two of them. It was a bond built on shared moments of vulnerability, on the shared weight of survival in a world that had turned its back on them both. The princess was a captive, a pawn in a game she never asked to play. And he was a soldier, trained to follow orders without question. But now, standing side by side, they were no longer just enemies or captives. They were two people caught in the same web of fate. "Stay close," the soldier muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. His words weren't just an order. They were a plea. He didn't want to admit it, but the thought of her being hurt, being taken from him, was unbearable. The princess didn't answer right away, instead letting the weight of his words sink in. She had heard many things about humans, most of them terrible. Her people had painted them as ruthless killers, bent on conquering all that stood in their way. And yet, here she was, standing beside one of them, in a jungle that could very well be her last battleground. And somehow, she found herself feeling safe for the first time in what felt like forever. Safe, not because of the weapons the soldier carried, but because of something deeper, something she couldn't explain. She had been trained to see humans as nothing more than obstacles, as enemies to be defeated. And yet, the soldier had shown her a different side of them. His kindness, his willingness to risk his own life to protect hers. These things didn't fit the narrative she had been taught. The princess had spent her entire life preparing for war, for conflict, for the day when her people would rise against their oppressors. But now, she was beginning to see that war wasn't just about power. It was about the people who fought it. The ones who bled, who died, who sacrificed everything for a cause. Her hand, almost without thinking, moved closer to his. The touch was light at first, barely a brush of fingers against the soldier's armored sleeve, but the soldier stiffened, his breath catching in his throat. The air around them seemed to thicken, and for a moment, the sounds of the jungle disappeared entirely. The soldier turned his head, his eyes locking with hers in a way that made everything else fade away. For a second, neither of them spoke. There was no need. In that brief, fragile moment, they both understood. They understood the weight of their situation, the danger they faced, but also the deeper connection that had formed between them. The princess had been raised to believe that humans were monsters, that they were nothing more than tools of war, but the soldier had shown her the humanity in them, the tenderness, the strength, the vulnerability. And the soldier, in turn, had seen something in her that made him question everything he thought he knew about the aliens. She wasn't just an enemy. She wasn't just a princess or a pawn in some game. She was someone who had been forced into this fight, someone who had her own fears, her own dreams, her own struggles. The princess could feel her heart beating faster, the rhythm of it echoing in her ears. She had spent so much of her life focusing on the battle, on the conflict, that she had never stopped to think about what lay beyond it. She had never considered the possibility of finding someone who could make her feel safe, who could make her question everything she had been taught. But here, in the middle of the jungle, with nothing but the soldier beside her, she realized that maybe there was more to life than just war. Maybe, just maybe, there was room for something else. The soldier, sensing the shift between them, took a cautious step forward. His hand reached out, almost as if by instinct, and for the briefest moment, he cupped her face in his palm. The touch was gentle, almost reverent, as if he was afraid to break the fragile connection they had formed. His thumb brushed against her cheek, and the princess felt a spark of warmth spread through her. The moment hung between them, suspended in time, as if the entire universe was holding its breath. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the moment was shattered by the sound of distant footsteps, shuffling, growing closer. The soldier jerked back, his hand falling to his weapon in an instant. His expression hardened, and the tension between them was replaced by the familiar weight of danger. The battle was never far behind. But as they both turned toward the sound, the princess couldn't help but steal one more glance at the soldier. She had never imagined that a moment like this could exist in the middle of war, where everything seemed to be falling apart. And yet, here it was. The connection between them was real, undeniable, fragile, but real. And whatever happened next, the princess knew one thing for sure. Nothing could ever be the same again. The thick jungle air was heavy with tension as the soldier's hand instinctively reached for his weapon. His eyes darted across the shadows, searching for any signs of movement. The sound of footsteps grew louder, but they weren't the hurried steps of a predator. No, these were measured, deliberate, confident. Whoever was coming knew exactly where they were going. The princess, too, felt it. The change in the air, the weight of danger that seemed to settle around them. She had been trained to sense threats, to read the subtle signs of ambush. And she could feel it now. Something was wrong. The calm they had shared just moments before had vanished, replaced by a sense of dread that seemed to grow with each passing second. "Stay close," the soldier muttered, his voice tight with urgency. His eyes never left the shadows, his body tense and ready. The princess nodded, her heart racing as she followed his lead, staying just behind him, her own instincts telling her that this wasn't just another attack. This was different. She could feel the air crackling with something else, something darker. It happened in an instant. The soldier's sharp eyes caught the first glimpse of movement, and before he could react, a burst of energy tore through the air, striking the ground just feet away from them. The blast was deafening, sending a shockwave through the jungle that rattled the leaves and shook the very ground beneath their feet. The soldier jumped into action, pulling the princess behind him, his body a shield, his gun raised, but it was already too late. From the shadows emerged a group of soldiers, not human. They were cloaked in dark armor, their movements swift and silent, blending into the jungle like phantoms. The princess's breath caught in her throat as she recognized them. They were from her own faction, her people, but something was wrong. The faces hidden beneath the helmets were cold, their eyes devoid of emotion. There was no mercy in their movements, no hesitation. Just cold, calculated efficiency. The soldier fired first, instinctively, taking down two of the attackers in a flash of brilliant light. But the others were too fast, closing the distance between them with unnatural speed. The soldier gritted his teeth, trying to protect the princess, but the situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. The princess, watching in horror as the soldiers advanced, realized the truth too late. Her people, her own faction, had betrayed them. The soldier was right to distrust her. This was no random attack. They were here for her, for him, for both of them. "Get back," the soldier yelled, his voice desperate, his eyes wild. He shoved the princess behind him again, but she resisted, her hands gripping his arm. She couldn't leave him. Not now. Not after everything they had been through together. But the soldier was a man of action, not words, and his desperation was clear. He couldn't afford to think about her safety. Not anymore. But it wasn't the soldiers who broke her resolve. It was the voice that rang out from the shadows, cold and filled with authority. "Stop," the voice commanded. "Lower your weapons." From behind the soldiers stepped a woman, tall and regal in her posture, her face obscured by a dark visor. But the princess knew her instantly. It was Commander Celine, her own superior, the woman who had mentored her, trained her, and given her everything she thought she knew about loyalty. But the look in Celine's eyes was not the one she had known. There was no warmth, no connection, just cold, impassive calculation. "Celine," the princess whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos. Her heart was racing, the betrayal sinking deep into her chest. The woman who had once been her mentor, the one she had trusted above all others, was now the one standing against them. And it was clear there was no going back. The soldier glanced at the princess, his eyes narrowing. This was a setup, wasn't it? He growled, his grip tightening on his weapon. "You were never in danger, were you?" The princess's eyes flickered towards Celine, her heart heavy with the realization. She had been played. They had both been played. The princess had thought that her people, her faction, were still fighting for what was right. She had been so sure that she was on the right side of the war. But now she saw the truth. There was no honor left. No truth, just power. The same power that had destroyed everything she once believed in. "I'm sorry," the princess whispered, her voice breaking. The words felt like a weight on her chest. She had trusted her. She had trusted Celine to protect her, to guide her. And now she had betrayed everything they had fought for. Celine's lips twisted into a cruel smile. "Sorry," she repeated. "You have no idea, do you? You never understood the game. It was never about loyalty. It was always about power." The princess felt a wave of nausea roll through her. She had been so naive, so certain that everything would make sense once the war was won. But now, all of that seemed like a distant memory. Nothing mattered anymore. Not the war. Not the loyalty. Not even the soldier who had been nothing but a means to an end in her eyes just days before. And yet now, as she stood there, facing the soldiers, facing her mentor, the woman who had been the one constant in her life for so long, she realized just how much she had changed. How much the soldier had changed her. He had shown her a different side of the world, a side she had never seen before. And now, as she faced the truth, as the weight of betrayal settled on her shoulders, she knew there was no turning back. "Take her," Celine commanded coldly, "and leave him." The princess's heart sank as the soldiers moved toward her. But it wasn't fear that gripped her anymore. It was rage. Rage at herself for being so blind, for trusting the wrong people. But more than that, it was fear for the soldier, for the man who had risked everything to protect her. "No," she screamed, trying to break free of the soldiers who were grabbing her. But it was no use. They were too strong. And just as she felt herself being pulled away, the soldier fired once more, his shots precise and calculated, taking down 2 more of the attackers. But it was too late. "Let her go," the soldier shouted, his voice filled with desperation. But Celine's laughter echoed through the jungle, cold and cruel. "You can't save her," she said. "Not now." The soldier's eyes locked with the princess's, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. All the noise, the chaos, the battle, it all faded into the background. All that mattered was the look in her eyes, the silent plea for help, the realization that everything they had shared was now at risk. The princess realized, with gut-wrenching clarity, that she had never truly understood the stakes. The betrayal, the lies, and the power games were only the beginning. They were just pawns in a much larger game. And in that moment, everything she thought she knew about loyalty, trust, and war shattered. And as the soldiers closed in, she realized that the true battle had only just begun. The tension in the jungle was thick, almost suffocating. The soldier's heart pounded as he watched the princess being dragged away, his mind racing with thoughts of how to stop this madness. His hand trembled slightly on his weapon, but there was no time for hesitation. The betrayal had stung, but it was nothing compared to the burning desire to save her. He couldn't let it end like this, not after everything they had fought for, not after everything they had been through together. The soldiers around him moved with eerie precision, each one trained to eliminate any threat. The soldier knew that if he didn't act fast, there would be no chance of saving the princess. He had to find a way through their defenses to outsmart them. But the odds were stacked against him. Celine's soldiers were formidable, and they knew the terrain far better than he did. The soldier's mind raced, calculating his options. He glanced around, searching for anything he could use to his advantage. The jungle, dense with foliage, seemed to offer no escape. It was the perfect place for an ambush, and the soldiers had already set their traps. The soldier had faced worse odds, though. He was trained for this, if he could just. A loud explosion echoed in the distance, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy artillery. The soldier froze. The air trembled with the force of the blast. This wasn't a typical skirmish. It was something bigger, something more dangerous. He had no time to waste. "Don't you understand?" Celine's voice broke through the chaos. "This war is bigger than you, bigger than both of us. It's about control, power. And you were never meant to be part of it." The soldier's blood boiled as he heard her words. Her voice, once a symbol of strength and wisdom, now carried only the weight of betrayal. The princess's face, pale and filled with a mix of confusion and defiance, locked with his for just a moment. Her eyes begged him to fight, to not give up.